There is currently a very lively debate on who is actually winning the war in Ukraine. That's because after a first period when Ukraine surprised everyone, and especially Russia, with its strong resistance to the invasion and showed that it can stand up to the invading army, the prolonged trench fighting of the last year has resulted in a slow but steady Russian advance. So it's natural to ask whether is Russia winning or losing the war in Ukraine. Well, the answer is quite complex, and we'll try to break it down in a bit more than 10 minutes. Some say that Russia is winning, pointing to the land it has seized. Others claim it's losing, citing its battlefield struggles and its economic isolation. But to really understand Russia's position, we need to separate different levels of analysis, because what can look like a victory on one can be a disaster on another level. So let's start with the military facts. Russia currently controls a bit more than about 20% of Ukraine's territory. That actually sounds like a lot, but we have to consider that much of this land was already under its indirect control before the war even began. Donetsk and Luhansk regions were in fact already governed by pro-Russian separatists since 2014. So Russia didn't need to do anything to seize its control except declaring it wants to do so. The situation in Crimea is similar, but even more straightforward, as Russia officially annexed it again in 2014. So what did actually Russia seize during this war? The biggest piece of territory is definitely the land bridge between Donetsk and Lugansk, Donbas, and Crimea, which includes the cities of Melitopol and the biggest urban victory, Mariupol, a city of almost 500,000 inhabitants, which has been heavily devastated and where now only some 100,000 residents still live. Of course, we shouldn't forget also about the victory in Bakhmut, which is an actually relatively small town of about 70,000 people, was a small town of about 70,000 people, and for which Russia needed the entire Wagner elite force to succeed in its goal. And at the end, there is the only regional capital Russia managed to conquer, Kherson, which was captured in the war's early days, but which Russia lost months later. So Russia has captured and held 0 of the major cities of Ukraine, besides Donetsk and Luhansk, which, as we saw, were already beyond Ukrainian control at the beginning of the invasion. Now let's zoom out and let's see the bigger picture. Despite its nuclear arsenal and massive military budget, Russia's war performance does not look like that one of a global superpower. It has thrown everything, bar nuclear weapons, troops, missiles, and economic resources, into this war. The Russian population has supported and continues to support it, but even the most loyal citizens are growing tired and would welcome a ceasefire, if not full peace, as independent polls show. Russia thought it could win on its own terms, and here it actually miscalculated. It expected a more mild reaction from the West, but in reality, the latter didn't back down. Instead, sanctions hit hard, even though Russia doesn't want to acknowledge it, forcing it into economic dependence from China. Moscow also hoped for a divided NATO, but at least as for now, NATO grew stronger, expanding with Finland and Sweden. And most of all, Russia didn't plan to fall into a geopolitical situation where it would be forced to become dependent on China. And here lies the real problem. Russia wanted to be an independent power, but instead it's becoming China's junior partner. Xi Jinping is now Russia's lifeline, but this comes at a high price. China now buys Russian oil, but at deep discounts, and the price for its tech support is long-term control over trade. China is using Russia's war to strengthen itself, while Russia's influence shrinks. And guess what? Putin knows all of that. Russia is now trapped economically, militarily, and diplomatically, which is why when the US administration offered talks, Moscow jumped at the opportunity. That's because Putin he needs an exit. He wants to regain leverage on a global scale, and most of all, he wants to stop being China's sidekick. And this brings us to today. Russia pushed into a corner and the US making a strategic move, looking like a new global shift in the making. Let's take one, maybe two steps back. For over 2 decades, Russia has been fighting to reclaim its status as a global superpower. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was left humiliated, weakened, and sidelined by the West. NATO expanded, Eastern Europe turned towards Brussels and Washington, and Moscow found itself on the defensive. Putin's goal? Reverse the decline, rebuild the empire, and restore the old influence. In 2008, the war in Georgia was the first major warning shot to the West. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, a bold move to test NATO's resolve. And ultimately, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a very risky attempt to force the world to recognize Russia's power. But here lies the problem. The world didn't react as Putin expected. Ukraine didn't surrender and NATO expanded to Scandinavia. The West didn't back down. It flooded Ukraine with weapons and tried, though with only limited success, to isolate Russia with sanctions. Instead of proving its strength, Russia revealed its weaknesses. And now it's paying the price. Let's get one thing straight. Russia's primary goal with the Ukraine invasion was not land. Its initial plan was to enter Ukraine, force a regime change, installing a new puppet leadership, and then possibly retreat. In fact, the real reason for the invasion was and is strategic security. Putin saw Ukraine drifting towards NATO and feared that Russia's buffer zone was disappearing. The war was supposed to send a message. Russia is back, and so is her sphere of influence, in which Ukraine plays an important part. But instead of achieving this goal and forcing the US to the negotiating table, Russia trapped itself in a war where it seemed that nobody can win, but where Russia needs a victory, or at least to show it achieved one, much more than Ukraine does. Today, Russia holds 20% of Ukraine, but at a staggering cost. It lost its elite paratroopers, it burned through decades worth of military stockpile, and now it's reliant on North Korean missiles and soldiers and Iranian drones, not to talk about its dependence to China. Here's the biggest irony of Ukraine's war. The real winner isn't Russia. It's not even the US, and of course it's not Europe or Ukraine. The real winner is China. Because while the war has bled Russia dry, Beijing has only grown stronger. China is now Russia's biggest buyer of oil and gas, but at humiliatingly low prices. China also controls critical supply chains that Russia desperately needs. China is quietly expanding its influence in Central Asia, Russia's own backyard. And Putin? He has no choice but to tolerate all of it. For centuries, Russia viewed itself as the dominant Eurasian power, balancing between East and West. But today, it's stuck into an uncomfortable situation. A junior partner to China, dependent on Beijing's economic muscle, and losing its strategic autonomy. In this situation, Washington sees an opportunity, and it's making its move. For years, the United States feared Russia-China's alliance. But now it's clear. Russia doesn't want to be China's puppet, and China is using Russia much more than Russia is able to use China. Which is why, for the first time in years, the US is warming up talks with Moscow. Sanction relief is on the table, security negotiations are being hinted at, and Washington wants to offer Russia a way out of China's grip. Because if the US can pull Russia back, even slightly, it would shift the balance of power in this new Cold War, where the biggest stakes are not in Eastern Europe, but are in the Pacific, with Taiwan being the most prominent prize. And Russia? Well, it's listening. Russia is in survival mode, but it's also playing a very dangerous and risky game. If Putin has learned anything from history, it's that weaker powers can benefit from great power rivalries. During the Cold War, Yugoslavia played the US and the Soviet Union against each other, securing massive benefits from both. Now, Russia intends to do the same, but on a much larger scale. Here's the strategy. Reopen dialogue with the US, but without cutting ties with China. Extract favors from both sides, military tech, economic deals, diplomatic leverage. Position Russia as the ultimate swing state, a wild card in the new Cold War. But will it work? Well, that depends on how far Washington and Beijing are willing to go. So, to conclude, are we at the verge of a new Cold War power shift? Russia's war in Ukraine was supposed to cement its status as a global superpower. Instead, it has left Moscow militarily exhausted, economically weakened, and politically more dependent on China than ever before. But Russia isn't out of the game yet. It's trying to pivot between the US and China and is actively testing the US response, trying to find a new role in this global order. So, what's next? Will Washington succeed in pulling Russia away from China? Will Putin manage to play both sides like Yugoslavia did once during the Cold War? Or will Russia's position continue to weaken, making it China's permanent junior partner? The next months will be critical, and if you have any idea which you want to share with us and influence the debate, feel free to write it down in the comments. We and other viewers read them.